Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Thank you for returning to the channel once more. This video is asking what shall transpire if Donald J. Trump does not betray Ukraine. Most people think he's going to betray Ukraine. I think he will, because he said that he would end the war within 24 hours. He always overpromises, and that he would say that they've got to make peace with Russia or he'll cut off all aid, and if Russia doesn't accept that deal, he would increase the aid. Now, we've got to take this with a fistful of salt. He always overpromises and underdelivers. Remember how he was going to build that wall with Mexico? Not a brick ever built. Mexico was going to pay for it. Not a peso was ever paid. He was going to make medicines in the USA better and cheaper at the same time, with no explanation of how he was going to do it. He was going to end the carnage, and he was going to defeat ISIS very quickly. He was going to defeat the Taliban very quickly. Everything's going to be sorted out. That none of which happened. He was going to win the trade war. It could go on. It's just endless. There's no telling where you are with him. Is he going to do it? Now, the reason he might not betray them is he might be persuaded this will be a Kabul moment. If Ukraine loses, that'll really hurt your standing approval rating go really down. Now, the big difference between that and Joe Biden pulling out of Afghanistan is, of course, Trump is not facing re-election because he can't be re-elected because this is his second term. And a constitutional amendment of the 1950s limited presidents to 2 terms only. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the only one to have sought and secured a third or indeed fourth term, dying shortly after the commencement of his fourth term in April 1945. But Trump, despite his lack of constitutional knowledge, I think maybe even he knows that, and he was saying, "Oh well, Biden cheated in 2020, therefore I should be allowed a third term." He might be so deluded he honestly thinks he can have a third term, but really I think he's going to be less preoccupied by approval ratings. But a man of raging vanity like him certainly doesn't want to be seen as a loser, as weak, yellow belly, and so Ukraine needs to convince him that if he lets them be defeated, it'll come back on him. So that would to hurt his ego, that people he cares about would think badly of him. He'd not be seen as a tough guy. So that's why he might be able to convince him to carry on funding them. As I say, I think he is going to cut them off. Even if Trump is not minded to cut them off, he would have to get funding packages through the United States Congress. And I don't see a Republican dominated Congress doing that. It was difficult enough to get that $60 billion dollar aid package. Now, I was thinking about this, minus the United States, you look at NATO and the European Union, of course, they overlap. Not all NATO countries are in the EU, not all EU countries are NATO. And their joint economies are something like $25 trillion dollars per annum. $25 trillion. I know 25 billion in the world economy is a drop in the ocean. Bear in mind, and I've taken Turkey out of that because they're not contributing anything. So they could quite easily afford to fund Ukraine. I mean, I say easily, they could, but be a bit of sacrifices, as in taxes up here, spending cuts there, some deficit spending, stuff like that. But they wouldn't be willing to do that. It's tough enough to get them to give decent support even now. Um, and they'd be too parsimonious. But if the United States does go on funding them, how long can Russia carry on for? They always said sanctions were going to bite. Here we are, not far after 3 years in, and they finally really are biting, finding it more difficult to circumvent sanctions, and the inflation is raging. Very difficult to keep it down under 20%. Is really hitting their mortgage sector, and that's impacting the middle class. And by Western standards, the middle class in Russia is small, like 20% at most. But they really matter. They disproportionately matter. They're disproportionately in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They are the intelligentsia and so forth. They're highly mobile. They can more easily leave the country. They're more media literate. They're less Putinite, less dependent on the state, more savvy. And Putin really doesn't want these people out on the streets or just voting with their feet and leaving the country, especially as another wave of mobilization might have to come. So can Russia fight this war in 2025? Yes, nobody doubts that. We're almost in 2025. And people always knew that there were people in the middle of this year, people were saying, Russia can sustain it for another 2 years. After that starts to become difficulty. So middle of 2024, let's say to the middle of 2026, latter half of 2026, it becomes difficult. If it's 2027, that may well become impossible. But a week is a long time in politics. So we're talking over a year now. It's a very long time. And likewise in economics, somewhat depends what happens with world energy prices. Do they have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia or OPEC, the OPEC plus thing? This entente cordiale to artificially raise or lower energy prices. And so much of the Russian economy, so like 60% is from hydrocarbon exports, gas, some of that's coal, particularly to China. Um, so they've been spending cuts and tax rises announced for 2025. They will probably be deeper cuts and higher spending, higher tax rises than are announced in 2026 again. And that's when push really has come to shove. Now, they lived worse in Soviet times, yes, but the thing is, for over 20 years, people got used to decent standards of living in Russia. I know there was poverty in Russia, but it wasn't absolute poverty. It was officially, it was only about 10% of people below the poverty line. In reality, it's probably more like 20%. Things have actually got better for some people in the short term because of the war. There were some items which were really overpriced, like eggs. It was more difficult, inconvenient, more expensive to get certain sanctioned goods, having to order them via Turkey or the UAE or Kyrgyzstan or wherever. But it's getting a lot more difficult, and more banks in China and elsewhere are refusing to put through these financial transactions. So just as Russia is really feeling the pinch that this war effort might become unsustainable, is when Trump might say, well, we're cutting off arms to Ukraine. And the thing is, Russia's made significant gains, territorial gains, over the last month. It's been in a very high price, but they gained more in about 1 month than they gained in almost the whole of the rest of the year put together. Now, that was for various reasons. I think that Putin made an extra heavy effort before the US election to make Americans say, well, Ukraine's losing, let's give up. Incoming President Trump or even Harris saying, well, we've got to end this war in Ukraine, thinking that Ukraine is close to cracking. Another thing is the winter was coming, the campaigning season's almost over. It was going to get very muddy, and for a few weeks until the freeze, they could do very little because most vehicles couldn't even go off road. So really take advantage of the weather before it closed in, uh, and so they've done that. But it's about to get a little bit easier, at least in the short term for Ukraine, for reasons of the weather. So there's that, and they think that was Ukraine on the brink because recruitment was such a problem for them, and they're not willing to conscript people under the age of 25. The supply of volunteers for the International Legion for the Territorial Defense of Ukraine has more or less dried up. So also, Trump would need to be persuaded that if you abandon the Ukrainians, then you'll see as seen as weak, and Iran will take fresh heart. The Chinese will be encouraged to take back Taiwan, and there'll be more problems elsewhere. So you've got to be a tough guy and play hardball. But yeah, if the United States continues to support Ukraine, then it could get a lot more difficult for Russia in 2025. I don't think Russia's on the brink of being defeated. And I said this in the beginning. I don't see Ukraine getting back Crimea ever. I don't see how they can. A lot of the illegally occupied territories were taken only in 2022. I don't see how they can. And one of the things the Ukrainians should have been doing, and they seem to have made very little effort to do, is to build a defensive line, like sort of Viking line. And the Russians have shown them how to do it, something like that. That if you cannot regain your land, you could at least avoid losing more, and put a lot of your efforts and resources into that. And wouldn't be so casualty intense. And you defend that, at least your casualties will be down because your troops will be fairly safe, fairly in their bunkers and so on. Bear in mind, Ukrainians failed to break through the Sotovikin line, despite having more advanced technology and often better training than the Russians have got. So if you or the Ukrainians have got the more advanced technology, the better training, and good defenses, then that'll be an even tougher nut to crack than what the sort of Viking, what the Cedar Viking line was. Anyway, thank you for watching my channel. Make sure you subscribe to me on Patreon, donate on PayPal, George Callahan 79 at gmail.com. Goodbye.